She went to Cambodia to find a piece of her past. What Elise Carter found instead was a temple lost to time, and something ancient that spoke through her lips the moment she stepped out. She doesn't remember entering it. She doesn't even remember her name. But she's fluent in a language no one has spoken in over 10,000 years. What if the person who came back wasn't really her? How much of yourself can you lose before you're no longer you? Elise Carter had always been a seeker of the impossible, the kind of person who shunned glossy brochures and well-paved trails for paths marked only by rumor and contradiction. A 31-year-old travel vlogger with an appetite for places most considered too remote or too dangerous, Elise didn't just want to see the world, she wanted to unravel its buried riddles. But her latest journey to Cambodia wasn't driven by views or followers. This one was personal. Months earlier, her estranged father's old trunk had surfaced in a storage auction. Inside, along with mold-stained clothes and old photographs, was a battered leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with bizarre hand-drawn symbols and fragmented entries in English. Entries that grew more erratic as they chronicled his descent into obsession with a temple no map had ever recorded. The last dated note was a chilling line: "They listen through stone. They remember through blood." That was the last anyone had heard from him. While her mother insisted he had simply abandoned the family for another one, Elise had never accepted it. And now, as she boarded a dust-covered bus bound for the province of Ratanakri, the worn journal clutched tightly in her hand, the notion that her father might have found something no one else had, it consumed her. Locals were friendly until they saw the journal. Then they grew silent. Her questions were met with vague warnings, some laughing them off as myths meant to scare foreigners. Others became visibly tense, muttering about the place where even gods go blind. Intrigued rather than deterred, Elise eventually met an old tuk-tuk driver named Vanak who spoke quietly over the roar of jungle cicadas. He had seen strange lights in the forest, he said, and once heard his brother cry out from deep within, years after he'd gone missing. Vanak offered to take her close, but no farther than the first stone marker. Beyond that, he warned, she would walk alone. Their journey began before sunrise, weaving through unpaved roads, dense forest, and abandoned military outposts reclaimed by vines. As they approached the area Vanak refused to name, strange carvings began to appear on ancient trees, symbols nearly identical to those in her father's journal. It wasn't a coincidence. This was the same trail her father had taken. That realization hit Elise like an electric jolt, tightening her grip on the bag slung over her shoulder. When they reached the edge of a long-forgotten trailhead, a stone arch smothered in moss, Vanak stopped the tuk-tuk and refused to go farther. He wouldn't touch the stones. Wouldn't speak beyond a certain volume. "They hear when you say their name," he whispered. Elise stepped forward, alone now, into a jungle path where even birds dared not sing. Every footstep echoed. Her GPS failed. The air grew heavy, as if time itself moved differently under the ancient canopy. Hours passed with no sense of distance until she stumbled upon a half-collapsed pagoda. There, on one of the cracked columns, she found a word scrawled in red chalk. A name. Her father's name. Just beneath it, a message: "Not lost. Opened." Her breath caught in her throat. Someone had been here, and they had wanted to be found. Her pulse thundered as she continued, now pushing through layers of vegetation that seemed to cling to her clothes like fingers. Finally, she stood before a clearing where no birds flew, no leaves rustled, and where the air itself felt stillborn. In its center stood a structure unlike any temple she'd seen in her extensive travels, angular, symmetrical yet asymmetrical, as if designed by something with a different concept of geometry. There were no monks. No tourists. Just stone, and silence. Her first step into the clearing was like crossing into another dimension. Her ears popped. Her vision shimmered. The jungle seemed to recede behind her. There was no breeze, but she felt a cold breath on her neck. She turned sharply. No one. Still, a low hum began to rise from the earth, barely audible, but oddly rhythmic. Elise pulled out her phone, intending to record. The screen stayed black. Nothing worked. Even her watch stopped ticking. Something was happening here, something ancient and alive. A sudden gust of wind rustled the trees in a spiral motion, as though the entire forest exhaled. Elise moved toward the temple, unaware that from within the stone entrance, something was watching. The temple loomed in silence, its surface impossibly smooth and cold to the touch, despite the jungle heat pressing against Elise's back. She hesitated only for a breath before pushing forward, compelled by a magnetism that defied logic or fear. The entrance wasn't grand or ceremonial, it was a narrow slit between two immense slabs of obsidian stone, so dark it seemed to absorb light. As Elise squeezed through, her shoulders brushed the walls, and a static current crawled across her skin, as though the temple was tasting her. Inside, the air was dense with an earthy metallic scent, blood and clay. Her footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the acoustics themselves had been manipulated to remind intruders they did not belong. The flashlight on her chest flickered wildly, forcing her to rely on slivers of light that bled through fissures in the high ceiling, revealing faint traces of frescoes, some depicting half-human beings engaged in rituals too abstract to decipher. Unlike other temples she'd visited around the world, this one was absent of religious iconography. No deities, no offerings, just pure symbology that pulsed with an almost sentient energy. She moved deeper, passing through chambers where stone faces stared from walls, their features eroded yet still exuding something uncomfortably alert. In the third room, a low vibration began under her feet. The floor, tiled in a perfect spiral of jet-black stone, responded to her steps with tiny flickers of phosphorescent light, illuminating her path behind her, never ahead. As if the temple wanted her to move forward, not back. The farther she walked, the more Elise felt watched, not just from behind but from within. Her thoughts began to blur. She reached for her journal, flipping to the last few pages of her father's notes, which seemed to shift when held near the walls. Letters faded, reappeared, and sometimes rearranged themselves, aligning with symbols etched on nearby stones. When she copied one of the sigils from the wall and matched it to a scribble in the margins of the journal, a section of the floor ahead cracked open slowly and without sound, revealing a steep stone stairwell spiraling down into darkness. Elise didn't hesitate. She lit her emergency lantern and descended, each step groaning as though protesting her weight. The walls narrowed again, marked with claw-like indentations and faint red smears she couldn't bring herself to analyze. The temperature plummeted. Breath fogged in front of her lips, and at the bottom of the staircase, she emerged into a massive underground chamber, impossibly large for its concealment beneath the jungle floor. Here, architecture defied reason. Pillars twisted upward like petrified tendrils, floating stone orbs hovered just above basins of black water, and every surface shimmered faintly like obsidian laced with stars. The silence down here was absolute, not even her heartbeat seemed welcome. As she stepped forward, torches burst into flame along the chamber walls, lit without fire, illuminating a massive stone door at the far end. Her name was carved across it in letters unmistakably modern, Elise Carter, yet worn as though etched 1,000 years ago. She reeled back, dropping the journal, her heart hammering in her throat. Something impossible had happened. Someone, or something, knew she was coming. Before she could question the implications, a sound like flint against flint cracked behind her. A figure stepped from the shadows, a man in crimson monk robes with a face wrinkled like scorched parchment and eyes entirely black. His voice, when it came, was dry, slow, and oddly melodic, as if reading from a script carved into his own memory. "You followed the bloodline," he said, extending a hand. "Your father opened the gate. You must choose whether to close it, or become it." She couldn't speak. Her tongue felt thick. Her hands trembled. "What gate?" she asked, though her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. He only smiled and pointed toward the massive stone door bearing her name. "There is no return from the path once it is seen. There is only through." Against every instinct, Elise approached the door, its surface shifting as she neared, showing glimpses of images she didn't understand. Warped cities, black suns, and ghostly figures walking backward through time. She reached out and placed her palm on the stone. It was warm. Too warm. It pulsed. The moment her skin made contact, a searing heat shot up her arm, and a scream not entirely hers burst from her throat. Her vision went white. When it cleared, she was somewhere else entirely, still in the temple, but now the chamber behind her had vanished. She stood in a corridor lined with statues that looked freshly sculpted, their eyes not yet dulled by time. There was no monk. No journal. Only that same low vibration humming under her skin, now deeper, now inside her head. A stone plinth rose from the floor with a single artifact, a circular disc etched with symbols swirling in and out of legibility. She reached for it. As her fingers brushed the disc, a voice boomed in a language she didn't recognize, but she understood it. The words burrowed into her spine. Memory is inheritance. You are not the first. You will not be the last. Elise collapsed, her body convulsing, visions flooding her brain, ancient fires, chants in the dark, a city built of bone and sound, collapsing in on itself by will alone. And then, silence. When she opened her eyes, the disc was gone. In its place stood her father, or at least a version of him. His mouth moved, but what came out wasn't English. It was the same language from the voice. She understood him, every syllable. He was telling her to go deeper. To go home. Elise tried to scream again, but only that ancient tongue escaped her lips. Elise woke sprawled across cold stone, her cheek pressed against a floor smooth as glass, though the walls around her whispered with the creaks and groans of something shifting. Her limbs were stiff, her fingers numb, but her mind buzzed with incomprehensible phrases, fragments of symbols she somehow knew the meaning of, and images of cities that dissolved into sand only to rebuild in the blink of an eye. Gone was the corridor of statues. Now she was in a different part of the temple altogether, a domed chamber whose ceiling pulsed with dim violet light, revealing murals that changed as she stared at them. Each time she blinked, the figures on the wall moved subtly, like a flipbook rendered in ancient ink. One depicted a figure being split in two, one half human, the other disintegrating into mist, and then reassembled by a glowing orb above a pyramid of teeth. Elise staggered to her feet, noticing that the ground below her glowed faintly where she stepped, just as it had earlier, only now the light responded to her heartbeat. The journal was gone. Her bag was gone. She no longer had any tether to her old life. Just her breath, and the symbols now burned into her memory. She moved forward through a narrowing archway that funneled her into a tunnel carved in angles so unnatural they seemed to pull at her peripheral vision. The more she walked, the more she questioned whether the temple obeyed the rules of geometry at all. Doorways curved inward like collapsing lungs. Shadows bent in two directions at once. Sometimes she caught reflections of herself on the polished stone, but the reflections didn't match her gestures. They stared back, unmoving, as if waiting for her to notice. She did, eventually. One of them smiled. She turned away in horror, not because the smile was sinister, but because it was knowing. Past the tunnel, the walls widened again to reveal a descending ramp. This one was flanked by relics, stone urns sealed with wax, bones etched with markings, and suspended jars holding preserved eyes that blinked slowly as she passed. Despite the surreal terror of it all, Elise felt no fear. She felt compelled, driven by an invisible thread pulling her deeper. At the base of the ramp, she emerged into a cavernous sanctum, circular and impossibly vast, where a dais rose in the center, surrounded by concentric rings of seated statues. Each one was different. Some wore masks, others had faces smoothed away by time, but they all faced the dais with rapt attention. As she stepped closer, she realized the dais was not empty. A single orb levitated there, spinning slowly, emanating a low hum that resonated deep in her chest. The language returned to her mind, symbols cascading in her vision, overlaying reality, as though her eyes now filtered everything through a forgotten code. She approached the orb, and as her fingers hovered inches away, a whisper erupted behind her. Not one voice, but dozens layered atop one another. She turned and saw nothing. The whispering grew louder, evolving into chants. The statues weren't statues anymore. They had turned their heads. All of them. Every face was now watching her. Not with hostility. With expectation. The orb dropped into her palm, sending a shockwave through her body. She collapsed to her knees as vision surged into her consciousness. Lives not her own, generations of memory funneling through her as if she were a conduit. She saw the rise of a civilization built on memory extraction, a society that had discovered how to distill consciousness into language, encoding it into stone, sound, and bloodlines. They had no written records, no libraries. Their history lived in chosen vessels, humans whose minds could hold multiple lives at once. But something had gone wrong. A fracture. A rebellion. An attempt to erase it all. Elise now carried a shard of that lost memory, and with it, the burden. The chanting crescendoed into a roar before dropping into silence. The orb vanished. The room darkened. One statue rose to its feet. Elise didn't run. She couldn't. Her legs were frozen, whether by fear or some unseen force. The figure approached, light revealing that its mask was made of mirrored stone. When it stood before her, it extended a finger and touched her forehead. She expected cold, but it was searing heat. Her skin smoked, and the pain was unbearable. But her mouth opened involuntarily, and she began to speak. Not in English. Not in any language she'd ever heard. But she knew what she was saying. She was reciting history. Events that predated the earliest known civilizations. Details she had no way of knowing. And still, she spoke. The figure stepped back, nodded once, and disintegrated into dust. The statues returned to stone. The chamber dimmed. And Elise stood, no longer quite Elise. The voice in her head was no longer singular. It echoed with the thoughts of others. She now understood the temple wasn't just a place, it was a vault of consciousness. A prison. A shrine. A beacon. She wasn't the first to awaken this knowledge, but perhaps she was the first to leave with it intact. She walked back through the path, noticing now that every symbol on the wall responded to her gaze. Changing, illuminating, welcoming. She knew their names. She knew their purpose. And she knew that, above ground, no one would believe her. When she finally found a shaft of natural light leaking through a split in the ceiling, Elise climbed toward it. The air shifted again as she emerged through the temple's rear exit into the jungle, which now looked unfamiliar, as though the trees had moved, as though time had passed differently in this sacred wound of the earth. Her skin was marked, symbols shimmered along her arms like tattoos that had always been there. Her voice had changed. Even her breath sounded different. A group of villagers saw her stumble into a clearing and ran to her, speaking hurriedly. But Elise didn't respond. She cocked her head in confusion. Then, slowly, she spoke. In the language no human alive should have known. The villagers froze. One dropped to his knees. The others backed away. Because what she had said wasn't just foreign. It was a phrase carved into the oldest tablet in the village shrine. A warning from the ancient ones. Translated roughly, it meant, the vessel has opened. The echo walks again. When Elise awoke in the straw hut on the outskirts of a Cambodian village, 3 full days had passed. She didn't remember walking back, didn't remember collapsing at the jungle's edge, and certainly didn't remember the group of local women who claimed they had found her standing in a shallow river, eyes vacant, murmuring sounds that made birds scatter from trees. A visiting American nurse from Phnom Penh had been called in to assess her. Elise responded to questions, but not in English. Not in Khmer. Not in any recognizable tongue. She spoke in staccato rhythms that sent chills down the nurse's spine, syllables that seemed to echo themselves, as if layered. The nurse tried to dismiss it as trauma-induced glossolalia, but the words were too consistent, too intentional. Elise's gaze, once lively and curious, had grown still, deep, as though her pupils no longer reflected just her own thoughts. She seemed calm, cooperative, even polite, but every sentence she formed was in that same alien language. And stranger still, she never broke eye contact when speaking, as if daring the listener to understand. When a local elder was brought in, one who had once studied dead dialects and oral histories passed down through generations, he froze the moment Elise spoke. He didn't understand her either, but recognized fragments, root sounds, and rhythmic structures from temple engravings thought to be indecipherable. He didn't return the next day. By then, word of her return had spread. Scholars from Phnom Penh arrived, then linguists from Thailand, and finally, a team of researchers from a university in London who specialized in proto-languages. They recorded her, tested her, prompted her with image cards and phonetic cues. Elise responded methodically but emotionlessly, never reacting to her own speech, as if she were merely a vessel for it. None of them could decipher the language, but one disturbing fact soon emerged. When Elise was left alone in the hut, she sometimes hummed. And when played recordings of temple frequencies, low, harmonic vibrations extracted from the stone's resonance, her humming matched the tones exactly, as if she had heard them from within. The villagers grew uneasy. One of the elders confessed that long ago, stories had been told of a voice walker, a person who returned from the forest speaking in a tongue that didn't belong to this world. Those stories had always ended in disappearance. Either the person vanished, or others around them did. Elise, for her part, showed no signs of confusion or illness. She ate sparingly, drank only spring water, and often sat for hours facing a wall, eyes closed, lips moving in whispers. Eventually, she was transported to a research facility in Phnom Penh for further observation. Elise did not resist. She seemed to understand where they were taking her, even guiding them when their vehicle veered off course during a detour. When asked how she knew the way, she tilted her head and spoke the same phrase she had repeated the night before: "The road is in the mind. The return is not yours alone." No one could translate it, but the way she said it, with such quiet certainty, unnerved even the most skeptical academic present. Once at the facility, Elise underwent brain scans, EEGs, psychological profiling. The results were both normal and impossible. Her brain showed the activity of someone in deep meditation, alpha waves in near-perfect sync, but regions associated with language processing were hyperactive even when she was silent. And when she did speak, those regions lit up in patterns that mirrored multilingual activity, as if she was speaking 5 languages simultaneously. Her blood work revealed no anomalies. No drugs. No pathogens. But one technician noted something chilling. The frequency of her vocal patterns matched harmonic readings found within the temple's walls. Not just similar, identical. Elise wasn't just speaking a dead language. She was speaking the voice of the temple itself. Her voice recordings were run through advanced software to find any linguistic roots. The results were inconclusive, except for one spike, one line of comparison that showed minor correlation to Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoan civilization. But even that connection was speculative at best. Then came the night she stopped responding altogether. Her lips stopped moving. Her eyes remained open but unfocused. For 12 hours, she didn't eat, drink, or blink. Security footage showed her hand moving autonomously, fingers etching invisible symbols into the blanket over her lap. Only when a linguist touched her arm did she react, jerking violently and letting out a guttural sound that cracked the room's overhead light. When staff reviewed the audio, they noticed something beyond the scream. Layered within the sound were 3 distinct voices, including one male, repeating the same 3 words: "The gate remains." That night, the researcher who had first interviewed her disappeared from his hotel. All that was found in his room was a single page torn from Elise's father's journal. It was a page that had never been published, never digitized, and had last been seen in Elise's possession deep in the jungle. They began to suspect she was no longer simply human. Or at least, no longer singular. Her memories, when tested, began to contradict themselves. She remembered childhood events from the wrong city. She claimed to have been present at events decades before her birth. During a cognitive test, she identified a device as a blood dial, despite it being a mechanical timer. She called the moon by a name never spoken before. A name that, when entered into a phonetic database, triggered a match to an inscription recently uncovered in an archaeological dig in northern India. One that had no established linguistic roots but bore the same curved glyphs found in the temple. Elise had never studied archaeology. She had never even left North America before her trip to Cambodia. And yet now, she was walking proof of something older than civilization, something buried intentionally. Eventually, the researchers began to fear her. Not out of superstition, but because when she looked at them, they felt seen, not just as individuals, but as descendants of something ancient and broken. They didn't speak of it out loud, but the feeling was mutual. It wasn't just Elise anymore. Something inside her was watching. One morning, after another night of silence, Elise walked out of the facility unnoticed, barefoot, clothed in only the linen robes they had given her. Surveillance footage showed her walking straight through locked doors, her face calm, eyes fixed ahead. No one could explain how the doors had opened. No one saw her leave. By the time they realized she was gone, she was already 5 miles away, walking down a dirt road, humming that same vibrating melody. And this time, the frequency she hummed matched not the temple, but a reading taken from a buried chamber beneath the Angkor ruins that had never been excavated. The global academic community couldn't ignore Elise Carter any longer. Her case had leaked, first through obscure online forums frequented by fringe archaeologists, then into the inboxes of university researchers, linguists, and ancient civilization theorists. A few dismissed the story as an elaborate hoax, but when high-resolution audio of Elise's untranslatable language was released by a whistleblower, things shifted. Dozens of ancient language experts from multiple continents, none of whom had ever collaborated before, all independently confirmed something uncanny. The phonetics matched isolated fragments from cultures that had no known contact, fragments of language heard in burial tombs of northern Siberia, whispered chants recorded in forgotten Himalayan monasteries, and symbols etched into stones in parts of Ethiopia and Peru that had stumped researchers for generations. But what chilled them most was the rhythm. Elise's words followed a cadence, a pulse that wasn't just linguistic. It was ritualistic, intentional, like a heartbeat encoded in speech. Soon, two theories emerged, each more unsettling than the last. The first proposed that Elise had become a kind of psychic antenna, unintentionally channeling a linguistic consciousness embedded in the earth itself, what some called archaeolinguistic memory. But the second theory dug deeper and darker. Dr. Galeen Marouk, a once respected Sumerologist who had been ridiculed for his thesis on inherited memory language, claimed Elise wasn't an antenna. She was a container. In an exclusive paper leaked before it was retracted under university pressure, he wrote, "She is not speaking a language she learned, she is speaking a language that learned her." Marouk's work had long argued that certain ancient sites around the globe were not just cultural centers but linguistic vaults, places where knowledge was intentionally encoded into space itself, waiting to be reactivated by individuals with specific ancestral or neurological traits. Elise, he believed, had activated one. It didn't stop there. Within weeks of her escape from the facility, cryptologists began reviewing aerial scans and ground-penetrating radar data from the jungle region she had traveled through. A second, deeper chamber beneath the temple was uncovered, untouched by modern hands. What appeared to be a subterranean city, long collapsed, lay beneath layers of earth and stone. Walls were covered in the same symbols Elise had spoken fluently. But more alarming were the carvings of people, men and women with vacant eyes, mouths open mid-chant, surrounding a central figure identical to Elise's earlier descriptions. Robed, mirrored face, finger extended toward a circle of flame. No records or local legends mentioned this underground structure. It predated even the earliest Khmer settlements. Whatever it was, it had been hidden intentionally, not lost to time but buried to protect the world from what it held. Meanwhile, Elise had resurfaced in northern Laos, filmed walking alone near an ancient cave site recently closed due to unexplained structural collapses. Locals reported hearing her voice echo through the limestone hills, even when she wasn't visible. One farmer, who approached her out of concern, later described what he saw in a video interview. Elise speaking to no one, in a tongue that seemed to vibrate the air itself, and then vanishing from view behind a single tree, only for the space she'd stood in to remain inexplicably colder than the rest of the area. No one could explain the temperature anomaly. Her presence now triggered environmental disturbances. Dead birds were found near temples she visited. Children claimed to hear songs in dreams, songs with words they couldn't remember after waking. A boy in Thailand began drawing symbols he had never seen before, symbols that matched inscriptions found in the buried city beneath Elise's temple. When Elise reappeared at a press conference held by a rogue anthropological society in Manila, she didn't speak. She stood still, calm, and as cameras flashed, she slowly turned her back to the crowd and removed the scarf around her neck. Gasps spread across the room. Etched into her skin, not tattooed but raised from her spine, were glyphs, deep, geometrically precise, and glowing faintly under the lights. These weren't scars. They were impressions, as if language itself had bloomed from her flesh. Then, without warning, she began to chant, not loudly, but with resonance so deep the microphones distorted. Every screen flickered. Audio files recorded that day all failed to save. But those who were there never forgot what she said. Because each of them, regardless of background or origin, believed they understood it. The message wasn't in words but in recognition. A voice older than language. And its message was simple: remember us. That same week, archaeologists in Mexico, Egypt, and Turkey independently uncovered similar patterns. Spirals of stone, inscriptions once dismissed as gibberish, now showing recognizable syntax thanks to what Elise had spoken. It was as if her emergence had unlocked an ancient linguistic key buried in the human subconscious. More unsettling were the incidents that followed. 3 researchers fluent in Linear B began speaking in their sleep. A professor in Zurich went missing after scrawling a message on his office wall: "She is not one voice. She is many. And she is waking more." Governments began to take notice. Elise was quietly labeled a potential translinguistic anomaly, monitored but never detained. No one dared. Every location she visited gained electromagnetic interference, unexplained frequencies, and surges of seismic microactivity. The Earth itself seemed to respond. And then, an even greater revelation emerged. In a manuscript believed to have been destroyed during World War II, a collection of sketches and inscriptions known as the Krasnov Codex, a page was recovered depicting a woman standing before a black temple, speaking symbols from her mouth while fire poured from her eyes. The image was over 100 years old. The woman looked like Elise. The Codex had predicted her. But the notes below the image were more terrifying still. The voice does not return to sleep. It finds the next. The vessel breathes, and through it, we return. Elise Carter was no longer the subject of a story. She was the warning carved in stone. The curse not spoken but sung. The mind that held more than one lifetime. And somewhere deep within her, beneath all the voices, one memory pulsed louder than the rest. The memory of choosing to touch the orb, the moment her will blurred with something older, something buried not just in the temple but in the DNA of humanity itself. And now, that thing had a voice again. Hers. 3 months after Elise Carter's last public appearance, she resurfaced quietly in New York City, arriving at JFK Airport on a commercial flight without luggage, passport, or ticket record. No one could explain how she got on the plane, nor how her biometric scan cleared U.S. customs despite her legal identity being flagged internationally. Surveillance footage showed her standing silently at the baggage carousel for almost 2 hours, not moving, not speaking, just watching people pass. Then she exited the terminal, walked into the freezing wind without a coat, and vanished into the subway system. Her family had long since given up hope. When her sister, Diane, received a call from a blocked number asking to meet at a Brooklyn cafe, she almost didn't go. But something in the caller's tone had sounded familiar, something too still, too measured, too Elise. Diane waited with trembling hands and wide eyes as a woman stepped through the door, one she recognized but also didn't. Elise's posture had changed. Her face was softer, but more distant. She smiled without warmth, hugged without weight, and when she spoke, her voice seemed delayed, as if the thought had formed elsewhere and filtered down to her. Elise remembered birthdays, childhood pets, even Diane's fear of thunderstorms. But there were holes, jagged ones. She remembered people who hadn't existed. She referenced events that hadn't happened. When Diane gently questioned her, Elise responded with kindness, but also a cryptic resignation, as if she were reciting lines from a script written in another era. "Memories are not always lived," she said softly. "Sometimes they are inherited." At night, Diane found Elise in the living room, carving strange circular glyphs into a wooden table with a butter knife. When asked what she was doing, Elise replied without turning, "Writing what they cannot forget." Diane didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Elise was gone again. Meanwhile, scattered reports began surfacing from across the East Coast. A woman matching Elise's description was seen in abandoned buildings, underground tunnels, and even near archaeological exhibits. Each sighting left behind strange phenomena: symbols drawn in condensation on glass, audio interference, power surges. A janitor at the American Museum of Natural History resigned after finding a series of ancient tablets mysteriously rearranged overnight, forming what he described as a chant you can see. Elise was not hiding. She was planting something. Whisper networks among linguists began to pulse with panic. The symbols now appearing on social media and street art were being recognized. Not by casual observers, but by those with access to deep data, phonetic algorithms, historic linguistics, anthropological archives. The glyphs Elise left behind matched untranslatable passages from pre-Columbian codices, tombs in Saqqara, and even cave etchings in Patagonia. What was more disturbing wasn't the language, it was the effect. People who studied the symbols too long reported vivid dreams, shared hallucinations, and inexplicable changes in language recall. A graduate student in Prague began speaking an extinct dialect of Sumerian after decoding just a few sequences. A child in Toronto claimed he could hear the stones thinking after watching a video of Elise muttering on a park bench. Hospitals began treating patients who complained of voices in their heads that sounded like their own, but older, slower, as if spoken through centuries. Sleep clinics noted a rise in cases where patients talked in their sleep in completely unknown languages. Elise wasn't just spreading a language. She was awakening something, triggering echoes long buried beneath the conscious mind of humanity. And through it all, she kept moving, a ghost tethered to no timeline, a body hosting something that once had no voice and now had many. A private investigator hired by Diane tracked her to an old theater in Lower Manhattan. What he found would never be released to the public. Inside, etched into the stage floor with surgical precision, was a massive spiral of interlocking characters, each glowing faintly under black light. Elise stood at the center, eyes closed, arms raised, chanting, not loudly, but in a low rhythm that caused the building's lights to flicker. The investigator described the sound as not a voice, but a current. She paused when she noticed him, opened her eyes, and whispered, "You've seen enough." Then the footage from his camera corrupted, every file overwritten with a repeating phrase, "She is the door that remembers." He resigned the next day, reportedly moved to a monastery in Bhutan, where he refused to ever speak of what he'd witnessed. The final known footage of Elise came from a commuter's phone. She was seen walking into the Atlantic Ocean from a beach in Rhode Island. Not running. Walking. Fully clothed. The sun was rising behind her. The water climbed to her knees, her waist, her shoulders, until she vanished beneath the waves without a ripple. The Coast Guard searched the area for days. No body was ever recovered. But 2 nights later, in that same beach town, residents reported hearing a woman's voice echoing from beneath the boardwalk. Not screaming. Singing. The same 3-tone melody recorded in the temple cave months before. Linguists analyzed the pitch pattern and discovered it aligned perfectly with the Fibonacci sequence when transposed into musical notation, a mathematical structure deeply embedded in ancient architecture worldwide. Back in Cambodia, the temple Elise had entered was found partially collapsed, the interior completely inaccessible. What little data was salvaged before its ceiling showed a massive increase in EM activity. The village elder who had warned Vanak long ago was found dead, clutching a rolled parchment that hadn't aged a day. On it was a single phrase written in red ochre, "She has opened the line." Months later, children began to report dreams of a woman walking through stone corridors, humming in spirals. Scholars began referring to Elise not as a subject, but a phenomenon, the Carter convergence. Some believed she was the result of accidental possession. Others believed she was chosen by something waiting beneath time. But those who had seen her eyes, the way they saw through centuries, had no doubt, Elise Carter had not come back alone. The final question that haunted everyone who knew her was never spoken aloud, but it lingered in glances, in unsubmitted research papers, in hushed conversations across time zones. If Elise was just the vessel, who, or what, was speaking through her now? And how long until it found its next voice?